but they are. Our next luncheon will be at Salty's in Seattle on July 28th. And David Donkey of Common Power, some of you may know his work, but they're doing national work to get out the vote and assure that our elections are fair and free. And he'll be talking about, so what does it look like for the midterms, and what's happening to election processes, etc. But if you don't know David, he is a very charismatic and wonderful speaker. So I hope you can all join us in July. In October, we have plenty going on with speakers, perhaps from Position for Social Responsibility and other groups, to talk about the threats that we may be facing, and not only the threat now, but the war itself, and what is the work that's going on across the country and locally, and how any of us can get involved in that. And that will be the topic in October. We're also pursuing the idea of having local social gatherings in places such as Everett and Olympia, Spokane, Kitsap, Tacoma, where local retirees can meet and greet and become a little more engaged. And we're looking for hosts that might be interested in hosting a local gathering of retirees. So if you're interested in doing that, please let one of us know in the leadership group, or just send me a note, because we like to organize that. And there was, in our surveys, there was some significant interest in doing that. You also may have seen requests for contributions for a newsletter, and Al and Sarah Thompson, Al Truscott and Sarah sent out a message about that. We've gotten, how many, Al?
Around
10 contributions. If you're interested in contributing to a newsletter with anything that comes to your mind about essays, travels, thoughts, philosophy, you're concerned about the world, or your lack of concern about the world, send it in to Sarah or Al.
So
it's in the request.
The
Here,
email.
speak up. Speak up here.
Okay. The email. The email for the newsletter, and Al, you're gonna have to. Is sorry. The email for the newsletter is bikroots, BIKRUTZ. No, sorry. It's ARMS, ARMS .COMM, like ARMS Committee, at bikroots.org, BIKRUTZ. So that's Al set that up.
Well, maybe we
So
send it out again.
we'll send it out again. But we've had some really wonderful contributions so far. We're hoping to be able to send out an electronic newsletter, so it can be basically as long as we want it to be, and you can read as much or as little as you want. But it's been really fun to see the contributions so far, and I think that we're all really excited. We haven't decided. I mean, it sort of depends on how many people who send contributions. But yeah, so the idea is 3 or 4 times a year.
Yeah, you may remember that under Glenn Harquist, he developed a hard copy newsletter, and some of the newsletters were 30 pages long. So, but we hope that this will also be another way of getting information and understanding where people are and what they're thinking. Well, I want to introduce Dr. Tom Payne. Tom was with us at Group Health from 1989 to 97. And he worked in primary care at the downtown clinic, and also worked with the Center for Health Studies in information technology. But he then went on to greater fame at the VA, where he led the installation of the medical record, and then at the U, where he is now Professor of Medicine Emeritus, and prior to 25 was Professor of Biomedical Informatics and Medical Education, and Adjunct Professor in Health Services. He was for 24 years attending physician at the University of Washington Medical Center and Harborview Medical Center, He's the author of 107 articles in the field, and it's a book on operating clinical computer systems. Tom also was the board chair of the American College of Medical Informatics. And we asked him to speak on the emerging issues of artificial intelligence in clinical medicine, both its benefits and its harms. And I just asked him, so is it going to be beneficial or will it be a harm? And he said, we'll see. So, Dr. Payne.
Thanks, Hugh. When Eric and Hugh suggested this talk, they predicted I would know a few people in the audience, and they were correct. They were correct, and I've seen many of you and had a chance to talk with you, but I know so many more that time won't permit us to reconnect. But it's a wonderful group, wonderful time in my career, and I'm delighted to be here. So today, you see the topic, and it is something you read about in any medium that you follow on a regular basis. It's just ubiquitous in our society. But I'm going to start, since it's a medical group, with a case presentation. And this one is a little easy, so I imagine you already are developing differentials as you read this. It's a 53-year-old woman admitted to the hospital with persistent erythroderma and lymphadenopathy. Been ill for 18 months, had been tried on many things. They didn't work. She came to the hospital quite ill, febrile, tachycardic, with big leg and the same rash. Actually, she was admitted to another hospital first and was transferred to our hospital. So just to save you from reading all this, you can read about it yourself in this CPC, the New England Journal. And it goes on for 7 pages, so I'm not going to read it all. It's a very complex case. But I think most of you, having heard what I've told you, have already thought, I think that is Sézary syndrome. Is that right? This is an example of an output that came from a AI application designed to help develop differential diagnoses. What this program is designed to do is not to give you the right one, but to give you a differential, a ranked differential. And to test it, they used these CPC from the New England Journal with very challenging cases. And it just, the differential here shows you a little bit about the sophistication of this application. With what I've told you, and I didn't read you the lab, but it comes up with diagnoses that aren't in my quick reach set of diagnoses, such as graft versus host disease, cutaneous T-cell lymphoma, Sézary syndrome, and other cutaneous T-cell lymphoma. It's a pretty, complex differential. And it came up with this very quickly, and it did it extremely well. And so you can see here in this article in Nature that the red on the top shows the application. It's called AMIE. And you can see that AIME in the top row had the highest number of the quality of that differential diagnosis. And the next lowest on this ranked stack is the clinician who is aided by that same program. So you have a human doing it and you have the program doing it. And then you have the third row, which is just the clinician looking up and up to date or Google, whatever they want. And then you see the performance of the clinicians unassisted. So you can see that this system is really nailing it. It gets it right more often than the doctors do, even in conjunction with AIME itself. So it's very, very good at this. So you might wonder, how how in the world can it come up with Sézary syndrome when it's presented with those findings? How does this work? So for those of you who want a little bit of background, that's all I'm going to give you, just a little bit. It's not because I have a limitless fund of knowledge on this, I do not, but I have this slide that kind of sums it up. And the joke is that if an application is described as being artificial intelligence, it's probably written in PowerPoint. If it's described as using machine learning, it's written in Python. So basically, AI is a term that is great for marketing, great for publicity, but it is an extremely general term that encompasses a lot more detail that I've briefly summarized here. Artificial intelligence is basically a system that looks like it's being produced by something that's intelligent. That's about all you could say from the term artificial intelligence. Within that field are techniques that are used to make something seem intelligent, and by far the biggest one is the field called machine learning. But that's not the only one. There are rule-based expert systems, which in our careers were more prominent than they are today. There was a system called Internist 1 in the 80s by Jack Myers in Pittsburgh, who tried to embody what he knew and his colleagues knew into the system, and it did quite well. Same sort of scenario presented with a New England Journal case. It did very well. There are other types of artificial intelligence that include statistical techniques. All of these together, wrapped up together, are what we call AI. But most of it today is machine learning. And if you aren't facile with machine learning, which I imagine some of you are, but most of you may not be, this is how I learned more about machine learning, okay? And importantly, I got this in the Kindle version so that you wouldn't see this book on my bookshelf on the same places. I thought that might be bad for my confidence building of my students. But basically, if you open this book up, it describes the methods used to perform the tasks such as the one I've just demonstrated. And it uses linear algebra, matrix, math, basically, in large part. And it does it on an unbelievably large scale. That's why you have the power generated by the dams on the Columbia now going to the data centers instead of making aluminum. It just takes so much power to run these things. It is a very interesting field, and one that you might want to dabble in. If you do, if you want to explore it a little bit, that's actually quite a good book. It takes you through the very basics. So let's go back to our field, which is clinical care, and talk a little bit about how it has been used and can be used and will be used in our field. So there was a survey done by a friend of mine, actually, who got together a group of leaders in healthcare organizations across the country and sent them a survey and asked them at this center, well, what about in your shop? What are you using AI for in clinical care, if you're using it at all? And I'll read some of this because it's a little hard to see from the back, but what you find is that the respondents who said that the organization is using AI in clinical care, the top category is radiology. Image processing, I almost said it pertains to pathology as well. That's number one. That 90% of the respondents said in their organization they're using some form of AI in radiology. The second one is early detection of sepsis. As we know, sepsis is a catastrophic illness that often sneaks up on us. And since a lot of the data in a hospital are now in machine-readable form, it's a great idea that we could detect sepsis before it's clinically apparent. The third one is ambient notes. Anybody used ambient notes in their practice? A few. It was really coming into maturity when I retired, so maybe that's also true for you. It wasn't as much of an option as it is today. But now, ambient notes, which is basically you see your provider with your permission putting a cell phone down between you and he or she, and it records the conversation and drafts a note for the clinician so that you don't have to start from scratch. And you edit the note, hopefully read through it, and saves you time. Third is not just sepsis, but risk of clinical deterioration. And then you get into the things that have to do with the mechanics of care, such as in-basket automation. You know, should this go to a nurse? Should this go to the doctor right away? Should this be automatically replied to? And medical coding. Now, I don't think they're being totally upfront about the financial uses of AI in healthcare. I think that's larger, but that's not our topic today. This is focusing on the clinical side. So the point here is, these are the categories where you see it the most today, or at least as of 2 years ago when the survey was done. Ambient notes has probably climbed up. I think radiology is still up there, but it has competition for the top category, I would guess, today. Does that ring true to those of you who have experience with this? These are the main categories that you see. Radiology is number one. Have you seen this quote by Geoffrey Hinton? Geoffrey Hinton got the Nobel Prize for his work in the foundational math of machine learning. So his quote, I'll read it to you. If you work as a radiologist, any radiologists out here? Don't see any hands. I think if you work as a radiologist, you are like the coyote that's already over the edge of the cliff, but hasn't yet looked down. People should stop training radiologists now. This is 10 years ago. It's just completely obvious. Within 5 years, deep learning is going to do better than radiologists. It might be 10 years, but we've got plenty of radiologists already. So he basically said, give it up. All right, your job is history. And so we shouldn't train anybody more to take a job that doesn't exist. Well, of course, he was dead wrong about this. He was right about a lot of things. He'd get the Nobel Prize, but he was wrong about this. And that sort of fits with many of the predictions about AI. So let's talk first about the benefits, because there are benefits. There's really no question. If you ask your own provider, you may have occasion to, you can see some of those things are really helping and doing what they hope to do. Radiology was number one. What's going on in the radiology department? And this is biased toward larger departments. So institutions that can afford big investments, that probably have specialization of radiology, not toward a small practice. But this was a survey in, I think it was the American College of Radiology's Journal of Radiology, that asked them if they're using AI, and if so, in what area. And many of them are using machine learning algorithms that they helped to develop. And they customize them for their very needs, self-developed AI. It's used for mammography to focus the radiologist's attention on an area that they probably would have seen, but maybe not. So it brings those areas into consideration. CT chest, particularly for detection of pulmonary embolism, is another use, because sometimes those images are a little hard to comprehensively review, and it helps in doing so. Same thing with MR of the brain, for CT of the brain, in particular looking for hemorrhage, so looking for early strokes. AI is used in the radiology department largely for these purposes as of a few years ago. And I always qualify this because in AI years, kind of like dog years, 7 years equals one dog year is 7 human years. In AI, it's like months. 1 month is like 7 years It moves so quickly that it's hard to keep slides current. This is an example of how it might appear to a radiologist. You can see, in this case, it's fairly obvious that you have a large area of interest in the lower right corner. It's red. So that's something the radiologist is very likely to have seen, but it's not as easy to see in image C, that small little area off of the ventricle, which is red and harder to see on the upper left-hand corner where it's there, but hard to spot. So AI in radiology is very helpful in pointing out these subtleties, at least to a non-radiologist, and making them more obvious. That's where it's being used. So Kurt Langlotz, a friend of mine who has responded to Dr. Hinton, he says, well, you may not have gotten that right, but it is likely the case that the radiologist who does not use AI will be replaced by a radiologist who does. So the two together are going to be more powerful than the human alone. It is growing and growing quite rapidly. I mentioned ambient scribes or ambient documentation. This method that I briefly described with a cell phone on the table between the patient and the practitioner, and creating a note draft for you to finish, that has been very popular because it cuts down on the time that doctors spend creating notes. I say doctors because it's mostly been applied to physicians, not yet to nurses, although it has to some degree. The amount of time spent creating notes is down now. The amount of after hours EHR time, so-called pajama time, where you're writing your notes at night, that is down. And by their own estimation, their quality of life and work satisfaction has gone up. So by those metrics, it's been very successful. It's mostly adopted in the primary care specialties, less so in specialties, and some areas where templating approaches have been so helpful, such as, well-child visit, where there are certain things you want to not forget to do. That isn't as broadly adopted for ambient scribes as an area that anything can be come to you during your interview. Come in with a variety of complaints, and you have to take a meticulous history. That's the art, but writing it all down is not so much what we look to as art. Ambient scribes help with that. All right, I gave you a few examples of advantages and benefits. I think it's important to understand that there's no free lunch, although I just finished one. So there's one free lunch. Thank you so much, Hugh, for the free lunch. Harms.
Nothing is free.
Well, to me, it's fun. So this is an article that was published in JAMA, and it was a review, not of AI, but of the testing and evaluation of AI. And it gives you pause. And I'll let the last paragraph be a little easier to read. And the existing evaluations of large language models, that's sort of thing like ChatGPT. Existing evaluations of large language models mostly focus on accuracy of question answering for medical examinations, like taking the boards, without consideration of real patient care data. Dimensions such as fairness, bias, and toxicity and deployment considerations received limited attention. Future evaluations should adopt standardized application and metrics and broaden the focus to a wider range of specialists. So this is basically saying there's not a lot going on in the careful analysis of this set of technologies, couched in the phraseology that JAMA uses. If you read between the lines, there's just not as much evaluation as one might expect. Ambient documentation. So let's say you like this idea and you want to save time writing notes, and you certainly don't want to write them at night anymore. Let's have our CIO get one of these for us. So this is the marketplace. All right? You've got a lot of choices. So you pick one, and these are not cheap. And maybe your budget is a factor, and you may look at it with that lens and filter out some that are not within your budget. Or maybe you have some other metric. It's a local company, or your nephew is on the board, or something like that. You choose one of these, and it seems to work. And your doctors are happier, and as a CIO or CMIO, you feel like this has been a big success. Well, you might think that this study was done before the broad use of ambient scribes occurred, but in fact, it has occurred afterwards. So this was an analysis of a sampling of those vendors using the same scenario, a simulated patient encounter, where it was very realistic, but it was not real. And it was a history taken, a physical exam performed, and an assessment and plan generated. And then they compared how some of those different companies' products compared. And these are some of the findings. And I'm going to focus on a few of them just to let you say, understand why I said to Hugh, we'll see, when he asked me what the future was. Because one of these substituted methotrexate when the doctor said metoprolol. So those two agents are very, very different. And if you are refilling a colleague's patient's prescription on a weekend, and the patient tells you, oh, it's a new prescription, it started with an M, and you look into the note that was generated, and it says methotrexate, you refill that when it in fact was metoprolol, there could be problems. Another concern would be that they talked about a CT scan for your abdominal discomfort, and we can find certain things, and that's why I think it's important for you, the doctor is telling the patient, to have the CT scan. Well, the note put in a fabricated result from that CT, which was not yet even ordered, let alone resulted. So these are the kinds of errors that occur from ambient documentation, and different vendor products had different kinds of errors. So, when we come up with a treatment for a malignancy, let's say CAR T cells, it sounds like a great idea. We don't just drum it up in the lab and squirt it in somebody's vein. We have this ritual in medicine that we actually test it first, and then we do randomized trials, and then we do bigger randomized trials, and then we introduce it in a controlled fashion and watch what happens. So technology should be carefully watched, in my opinion, before it's released into the wild. This is the sort of thing that's in the wild today. So that's why we have to be a little cautious about it. Another example of AI was the EPIC sepsis model. Anybody know the story? You've heard of EPIC, right? Okay, so EPIC had this system to address this problem of sepsis that sneaks up on us sometimes and causes catastrophic injury or death in people who we thought were doing just fine. And so the idea is, well, maybe there were clues. Maybe there was a heart rate that went up a little bit, doctor didn't notice it, the nurse didn't comment on it, or maybe there were other clues that lead us to put on our index of suspicion a little higher for this patient than for another patient. So they thought this was great. They tried it out on data that they had in their system from hundreds of different clients across the country, and they released it to hundreds of hospitals. The absent sepsis model. In fact, many places in our community use this. The trouble was that it wasn't prospectively evaluated. And when it was tested by some folks in Michigan, we discovered that the positive predictive value of this was 12%. Meaning if it interrupts clinicians 100 times, it gets it right 12% of the time and wrong 88% of the time. That's taking nurse attention and focus from somebody who may need it to somebody who really doesn't need it at that moment. It was generating alerts on 18% of all hospitalized patients. Identified only 7% of patients with sepsis that were missed by a clinician. And it didn't recognize 67% of the patients who really did have sepsis. So you might say, needs a little work. But it was already in production, not in one or two, but hundreds of hospitals. So this strikes me as premature. And in fact, we had grand rounds at the U on sepsis, and it was a basic scientist who was discussing how troublesome it is to detect. And I asked him in the question and answer, well, I'm just wondering, because we see a lot of these computer programs, these AI things that say they can detect it before the clinicians do. And his response was, I'm not sure that can be done. I don't see how it would work unless you're drawing blood from them. So this may or may not pan out. It may be that it will be very successful with refinement. It may be that it will sort of fizz out. At any rate, it should not necessarily have been introduced to hundreds of hospitals, both academic medical centers and community hospitals, before this sort of evaluation was done. Another concern of mine for AI is, where do they get the data from? How do they train these things? You know that when ChatGPT was created, which you may have used, there was a suit from the New York Times because a lot of the answers seemed a lot like articles that came from the New York Times, and for good reason. They were trained on articles from the New York Times, and they didn't pay the New York Times to use them. And so we don't have all the details, but I think there was a settlement made. That's New York Times, that's articles that you read about in the newspaper. What about the medical side of it? Where do they get those data? And this article in the Wall Street Journal talks about one source of data, which is medical records. Now, so-called de-identified medical records that are sold to companies. And these are from places very close to where we are today. This company is actually started in Seattle. So you can read, if you like, that this data are being harvested from records from real people. And if you go into the ER, they give you a little form that says, we're happy to help you. You got to sign this little form, gives permission to do it. And if you read that form very carefully, it tells the patient that this is what might happen to their data. But not everybody reads every last line of those forms, particularly when they're in with right lower quadrant pain, throwing up. You just don't get to that clause necessarily. So the data are coming from places that you might be surprised is made available to them. That is, I think, a concern, but they need massive amounts of data to make these things more accurate. Now, this is from the White House 3 years ago. So not today's White House, And there was a blueprint for AI, an AI Bill of Rights. And it had reached national attention, so the White House convened a group of thoughtful people, and they talked about the promise and some of the necessary protections. And in this document from the White House was a statement that referred to the epic sepsis model. Didn't say it out loud, but it says a proprietary model was developed to predict the likelihood of sepsis in hospitalized patients. Well, that's the epic sepsis model. And it pointed out that this is something we don't want to have happen again. So there's a lot of national concern that we have to do this properly and ethically, and that it isn't a simple thing to do. That concern is up against the reality that the so-called Magnificent Seven firms that make up 30% of Standard & Poor's index in the market, that's Microsoft, NVIDIA, Apple, those technical companies, they make up 30% of S&P. There is just enormous money at play. And healthcare is a very attractive target because it is such a big wedge of the economic pie. So if you have all of this investment looking for return, and you're trying to find a place to get that return, healthcare is a very attractive target. So as impressive as it is to me, all of these technologies and what can be done, and it all goes back to basically, I'm not going to say simple math, but it's math on a massive scale. That power has to be properly vetted, tested, and we have to resist the urge to prematurely adopt these things where money is in play. So I will stop there, and we have plenty of time for any questions that you might have.
Elise has a microphone, so questions for Tom?
I was wondering, in cancer treatment and genetic testing analysis, where it's going in those fields?
Very good question. I'm glad you have the mic because everybody can hear it. First of all, I am not an oncologist, but I do have a neighbor who designs proteins, got the Nobel Prize. And AI is extremely useful in generating candidate molecules for treatment of many disorders, including oncology. It's just amazing. This is David Baker, who you might have read a little bit about. He designs proteins for a specific need, and cancer is a very important need and target. So that's one example. Another example I'll say from a colleague of mine is knowing when you're trying to develop a strategy for the next step in treating somebody's malignancy, the first maybe hasn't gone as we'd hoped. How do you pick patients? How do you select patients for be a candidate for some approach? And it is very promising in looking through the myriad data. I mean, you look at the charts of people who've had multiple regimens tried cancer, they're massive. How do you find that person's regimen with all of this data and all of the possibilities? Those are just two examples. It's a hot area. I saw
Joe?
So the auto-generated notes, is that ambient notes, is that the phrase?
Yeah, not exactly auto-generated, but they...
Yeah. So when I saw your slide about that, and I saw there was increased clinician satisfaction in the use of it, my immediate thought was, well, given the change in the structure of how medicine is compensated and organized these days, the change would not be increased clinician satisfaction, but increased clinician workload. Are you aware of any instances where that's happening, where the leaders of medical groups are saying, well, you don't have to work as much, you don't have to spend as much time making a note, so let's have you see more patients?
Well, most of our administrative colleagues would have our interests at heart and would resist that temptation. I have heard murmuring about that. I have not found evidence of it because this is so new. But, and really its adoption was in response to the burnout that was occurring. The very costly, human cost is high, but the financial cost is also high. Burned out clinicians leave, retire early, move to other areas besides clinical care. That is an enormous problem. So that's really what the driver is for a lot of this. I haven't heard of workloads going up as a result. It might be happening.
The motivation of big medical institutions like the Franciscans and the Providence and owning medical thing in Kaiser, what is their motivation to have that last line on the permission slip at admission to let the records go to AI kind of things? Is it, they get paid for that obviously, but is it pennies or dollars?
You're right. It's a very big revenue source. And you went from 2 orders of magnitude, a penny to $1. I would say, let's go up a few more orders of magnitude. It's a ton of money.
Wow.
And this is written up in the Seattle Times. So you can just Google it, and I don't have to embarrass anybody who might be working for this company, but it gives me pause to think of this happening. It's not easy to de-identify data anymore. It used to be, just take out the phone number, social security. Who was it? I don't know. Now, it's not hard to figure out who it is. Why would you want to figure out who it is? I've got nothing to hide. Well, maybe you don't, maybe you do. If you're an insurance company, we'd kind of like to know some stuff.
I just heard Robert Wachter interviewed on the radio.
Right.
About his book, A Giant Leap, How AI is Transforming Healthcare.
Yes.
And he blew my mind because he's claimed that there's evidence that from a resting EKG, you can diagnose structural heart disease. So I went out and bought the book a couple days ago. I haven't read it yet, but what's that all about? I mean, the thing that further blew my mind is it really looked like it was valid from some small studies, but they didn't know how it works.
Yeah, that's the black box part. You know, we're used to quizzing somebody. You have an extremely bright consultant, and they say, Tom, it looks to me like a straightforward case of Cesare syndrome. And I asked the consultant, well, why do you say that? And he said, well, I mean, it's got all the markers. I mean, I have to list them all for you. And you can quiz a person. Back in the internist 1 days, there was this understanding that any artificial intelligence application should be able to explain how it came up with its answer. So Bob Wachter, who's chair of medicine at UCSF, has written several books. He's a very good communicator. He is bringing to light one of these things that I don't know how it works. And quite honestly, I'm a little skeptical. You know, I'm not a cardiologist. I don't know about this field. But how in the hell can they figure out what's going on in a very detailed way from beat to beat variability? and amplitudes of Q waves, and RF waves, and S waves. I don't know, but I respect Bob Wachter. He is a very bright guy. Another book he wrote is called The Digital Doctor, which is a nice introduction to this. Eric Topol at UCSD, if you're looking for books, he's another very good communicator and a very, very bright person. I think on the other side of the coin, from the people who are so enthusiastically reporting advances, I would point out another book by Emily Bender, who is a colleague at the University of Washington. Her book, just to give you a clue as to what her perspective is, the book is called The AI Con. So, a little clue there, maybe not quite as enthralled with it. Emily is brilliant, and as a linguist has used machine learning long before it was widely known, and her perspective is very different. It's a very readable book as well.
First of all, thank you. It was a great talk. I had a question just because AI is so popular now, and when you talk about regulations, how might you see AI in medicine be regulated? How might you see? How would we regulate AI in the practice of medicine?
Right.
Because we talk about it in so many different other fields, and we talk about it from a political standpoint. We need to put some regulations on how we use AI. So.
I think that's a very good question. The difference between AI and many other fields is the rapidity of advances. So the argument is made that you can't really do trials on this because it's like changing what's in your pill when you started the randomized controlled trial. The pill is stronger than it was when you started the trial. So your trial isn't really going to tell you anything. Well, I'm not sure I'd buy that. I think lots of things advance quickly. CAR T cells, I used that example earlier. Those advance very quickly, and yet, before we release them, we have a pretty regimented series of steps we go through. Phase 1 trials, FDA, approval, post-marketing surveillance, all that. And we didn't always have that. Back in the day, before my career, we didn't have that. We just sort of said, well, sounds like a good idea, let's try it. And we've learned as a society the hard way that we ended up having more harms than we might have had we carefully evaluated these agents. So, in my view, releasing the epic sepsis model was a little early. I think it would have benefited from regulation. Who does that? FDA. FDA is kind of busy. I don't know that they're the right answer for all of these, but I do think society should have somebody looking at these, giving them a gold star or a red star before they are used to treat 300 million, let alone 7 billion people. That's my view. I don't know how we would do it. I think we need more of it, though.
Do you know much about what's going on in Europe with the European medical system and whatnot with the AI?
Just what my friends tell me. No, I don't know how they differ. I know that in general, the European Union has been a little more cautious with privacy than the freewheeling, folks over on our side of the Atlantic. But I don't know how they differ with their adoption of AI.
Well, there are two sides to this. It's only as good as the input. I mean, the artificial intelligence can only regurgitate what it learns and where it gets its sources and all of that. So the scientific process of synthesizing and regurgitating trials is a part of that a scientist would follow to come to a conclusion. Whereas the input to the AI is not monitored in such a strict system that a scientist would go through. So that's a little scary in that regard. So as you're pointing out, it shouldn't be introduced until it's had some kind of check system to make sure it's valid before it's implemented. On the other side of that coin is that the more data it gets, the better it's likely to be able to report something valuable. But then we have this issue of privacy. There's no problem for me of releasing my information about whatever illness I have if my social security and my identifiers are removed, and the only purpose to have those identifiers would be for the insurance company to say, well, I don't want that person because they're a high risk, or I'm going to charge that person more because they're more likely to be hospitalized, or they're more likely to die at an early age. I'm not going to give them life insurance. Those are the consequences of our personal data being included. So, that was a lot.
I agree with your points, but I'll add one more to your opening statement. It's only as good as what you put in. So there was a trial of, ChatGPT. Should we use that for people while they're waiting to see their provider? And go ahead and use ChatGPT and find out if they should go to the ER right now or wait till next Thursday. And what they learned was it answered very well if an experienced clinician put the case into ChatGPT. It said, holy, you've got meningitis. You need to go in now, call 911. When you ask the non-clinician, John or Mary Q. Public, to put that in, their training doesn't allow them to know what is important information. My neck's stiff. Well, what does that have to do with a headache? And so in this trial, it was a prospective trial, one of the very few in this field, randomized trial. They found that these great large language models were no better than Googling in the general public. If you gave it to a doctor, they were amazing. I showed you the example of that.
Tom, again, thank you for doing this. You did this for a free lunch, so thank you. My question is, every time we use ChatGPT or Claude, and I recommend Claude because it's from Anthropic, and Anthropic thought the Defense Department and a much more wise company. But at any rate, as we use those systems, large language models are constantly learning. And can you or any of the scientists predict the rapidity of how much learning is occurring? And can you project forward 5 years or 10 years about the sensitivity and the accuracy of the systems, so that we may be in a much different place than we are. I mean, we will be in a much different place than we are right now. But how fast is it learning, and how much change can we expect over the next 5 years?
I would just say 5 years is not, that's like talking about the end of the explosion of the sun in AI terms. It is 5 months, 5 weeks. It is climbing an extremely steep curve and getting better at an unbelievable rate. Up against that impressive phenomenon is the reality of the clinical medical world, which isn't as simple as terabytes of data going in. It's a little on the messy side from time to time. Is that fair to say? Where we have a skill in extracting that information, listening to somebody's story, and knowing when to shut up and listen and when to ask directed questions. So the theme to the troubles that we're seeing, that I demonstrated here today, is putting this into the real world, getting that real data out that it would then ingest, but it isn't able to. So I have one of my studies, one of the most amazing things I learned, I was studying genetic predisposition to cancer. And I hired a bunch of medical students with a grant from NIH back in the day when those were usually to come by. Hired a bunch of medical students and said, I'm paying you by the hour. I want you to go through this chart. Take as long as you want. I want to know anything, anywhere, that has to do with this individual's predisposition for cancer. And so one example of this was a dermatology note from an outside hospital where the dermatologist was treating acne. And the little phrase was in there, well, given this person's strong family history of cancer, we probably shouldn't use estrogen to help. And it was, whoa, what family history of cancer? Nowhere else on the chart. But then we pursued it. Sure enough, it's a candidate for BRCA testing. So having that little snippet of data from a faxed copy, not all that legible, into the system is another problem entirely. It's the quality of the data, and that you all have a career in getting those data out. And thank goodness you have that skill, because that's usually what makes a difference.
I think this is a little bit related, but one of the things that troubles me is the belief that more is better. And that in epidemiology anyway, you try to design a study that's free of bias and other things, and just having a million bits of data compared to a sample size of 100 is supposed to be going to solve that. Is that really true though? Is it also possible that these larger data sets that are driving the output of AI could make it harder to detect things that are wrong about the process that is drawing the information that powers the AI?
There are examples of that. So, you're trying to detect malignant melanoma. Well, wouldn't that be helpful to just take a picture of a rash and don't worry about it? Or, my God, that needs to get checked, biopsied immediately. The trouble is, those were trained on not as many people with pigmented skin as people who didn't have as much pigment in their skin. And so it made mistakes, and yet it had this imprimatur of accuracy. So there's an example of having a ton of data that's biased. It's biased in the direction of how much melanin you have. And adding more could make that problem even worse. So yeah, we have to be thoughtful about this, and it's not a simple thing to just extract data. You have to look at the data you're extracting before you suck all the electricity out of the Columbia River to process it.
Is it even possible, though, to look at that much data?
Is it even possible? I don't know, Eric. I honestly don't know. Maybe you can overcome things with reaching a certain threshold, and that's beyond my understanding.
I'm over here. This discussion got me to thinking about the infrastructure for this whole thing. I mean, we've got all these data centers that have all this information in them. I assume they all share information. And then we have these various companies, Google, Gemini, Claude, blah, blah, that are pushing their AI. I don't quite understand how this works. I mean, is all the data shared to all these entities that are creating AI? Are they all looking at the same thing, or do they each have their own proprietary data?
The first answer is they don't tell us, we don't know. But
How are you gonna regulate?
I am skeptical that they will share it with their competitors. I have a feeling they paid good money to gather it, and it's giving them a competitive edge, or might, and I'm not sure that they wanna let OpenAI in on that. But I'm not involved in industry, so I can't tell you for sure.
Hi, Tom. First of all, thank you again for a wonderful speech. And I retired in May of last year, worked my last 9 years in medical informatics at Kaiser Permanente. And I just wanted to just give a little bit of a observation, if it would be helpful, to what I think was a transformative power of ambient before I retired. Because as you may know, when I would observe primary care docs and even specialty docs, they would be in the room and they would be focusing on the computer, they would be typing furiously, very telegraphic notes. With ambient, you literally have a conversation eye to eye with the patient. The patient feels that, the doctor feels that. To your question earlier, as of May 2nd of last year, there was no intention by WPMG leadership to leverage the efficiencies of AI to increase productivity expectation. They saw it as a way of improving work-life balance and that sort of thing. It is the responsibility of any clinician, as it always has been, to look over the note that's been created and make sure it's not factually inaccurate. We would always say it's like training your puppy, you just have to watch it all the time. But the other thing I want to point out is that the Cures Act, which came out a few years ago, mandates that medical notes are shared with patients by law. So the patient now is invited to look at a note that, in my opinion, is far more complete and better than it ever was previously, because it's based on a conversation and the concatenation of the different topics into that note by the system. So I think all the things you bring up are very important and very important safeguards. But I just want to say that, in my estimation, the evolution of ambient into the clinical workspace enhanced the humanism of medicine in a way that I thought was transformative. And I feel like I just wanted to make that point because I thought it was so powerful.
My response is, the last paper I published before I retired was, I'm not burned out, this is how I write my notes. And it was basically recounting what you just got through saying. I think we have to keep in mind, though, that not everybody reads the notes that are generated. Remember the old dictated but not read at the end? In fact, most people don't read them. So that metoprolol methotrexate is not picked up. And the other thing that's happening, it's interesting. Gordy Schiff wrote an article in the New England Journal. He pointed out that the assessment section is shrinking. And the reason is, we usually write the assessment and say, gee, this is puzzling. I mean, it could be this, it could be that. I could sort it out, but that's kind of a risky test. I'm not quite sure what to do, but I'm gonna do the following. That assessment used to be what I really focused on when I read somebody else's note. What were they thinking? That is shrinking because you don't necessarily have the time to think about these things in the exam room to the degree you can in mowing the lawn. So there are positives and negatives, but personally, I agree with you. Mine wasn't a commercial system, we developed it ourselves, and I basically dictated it, but it did all those cool things with it, and it lifted a burden off my shoulders. I would listen and watch the patient. It was much more fun. So I agree with you about the upside. I guess the downside we would just have to be aware of.
I'm sorry to switch topics, but I wonder if this AI stuff is being used in other arenas that are maybe more important than our profession, which is public health and political science. Is there any way that AI could be used to think that it could produce a product that would induce reasonable people to change our healthcare system from 98% fee-for-service to a European model of community service or patient service, and then buy some more if you don't like it? If it's just fantasy, kind of like my dream dreams.
That'd be a good question for David Horsey, the cartoonist for the Seattle Times. I would like to think that it would, but I'm not sure.
All of the discussion about quality of input made me think of a case I had not too long before I retired, where a woman reported a constellation of symptoms, but she wasn't very articulate. It was really difficult to make sense of what she was concerned about. Most of her communication was related to her anxiety and distress. So I did some tests to rule out some things and came up with the notion that what she was experiencing was probably a form of hallucination, and described what my dad experienced when he lost his thumb. And I said, sometimes our vision will kind of supply information just like he had when his missing thumb itched. And it wasn't until I told her that little story that she had a notion of what I was trying to describe to her. And she immediately experienced relief from all that anxiety. But to me, that's part and parcel to what we do, is really sketching information from people that don't know how to describe what they're experiencing. I don't see how AI can have any impact with that.
When I hear your story, I think of compassion. I think you did a good thing for this person. I think that's another place where, I don't care how many dams you put on Columbia, it's going to be hard to come up with that kind of compassion. And that's mostly, it's a big chunk of what we do. Francis Peabody, the secret of caring for the patient is to care for the patient.
If someone has asked this before me, I had to take a bathroom break, so if the question's already been answered, then I won't repeat it. But my concern is that, at least from the lay's perspective, is that the AI, in a generic sense, is like the Wild West. You've got a sheriff in Tucson, you've got a sheriff in Dodge, and you've got, whatever happens there happens. And I think most people would agree that somewhere there need to be some sort of guardrails, for lack of a better term, on AI. But being that the legislative process is so slow, even when it actually works, I don't see that ever happening. But there may be, for example, in medicine, there may be some guardrails that the Mayo Clinic comes with, some of the other major medical centers. But I don't think we're ever going to be able to have guardrails on AI, because there's so much that the hundreds of billions of dollars that are being invested, and if they can't monetize this, then it's all going to be money that's lost. But do you see any way that there can be any kind of, I guess, federal legislation or any kind of agreement on a guardrail for AI? Is it changing so rapidly that it's just not possible? I mean, I think that's probably the case, but I don't know.
Is that Lester?
Yeah.
We got to talk to you later. Just tell you for the first time. I think we've done it before in our field, long before my career. We came up with ways to regulate these new agents, new drugs that were being released. Not easy, there's a lot of money in play. We did it, and it helped. And last I checked, we're doing pretty well with cancer, heart disease, unusual conditions. It hasn't kept us from those advances. Maybe we had some downsides to that too, but I think our society globally could put some guardrails on this, as you put it. It's going to take a while because there's my 403B account will take a super big hit for a while, but then it'll come up again, because once you protect from disasters, then you have a ability to make further progress free of those sepsis model distractions.
Any more?
I had another question about the input of information. So if these large language models are scouring the internet and 80% are saying of the information they're referencing say that immunizations are bad because everybody is talking about it. Is there any way for the models to determine the accuracy of the information they're incorporating into their conclusions?
That's a good question. Can it be introspective and discount some of the data? I would say maybe, but I'm not convinced that this has occurred just yet because of the stuff that shows up. I was on the qualifying exam committee and we had to come up with questions for the qualifying exam. So I put my questions through ChatGPT just to see. And it came out with a very impressive document. Wow, this is incredible until I read it. Careful. And then it came up with stuff that just came out of left field. Like that CT scan report that showed up in the note when we hadn't even ordered it yet. So I haven't seen the introspection, as you know, I might say you're describing. I haven't seen that in action yet. Maybe somebody has. I'm not aware.
One more. I have an acquaintance who is doing what he calls scenario safety planning at Google, and is setting up scenarios for Google's AI system to see if it gets it wrong, and then they program it to get it right. And so there are companies that are doing that, about the morality, the ethics, and trying to program it so it does the right thing. I think that's just in the beginning. And as you said, I think, as you so wisely said, we don't know what's going to happen yet. And we don't know when there will be the will to regulate, but obviously it needs regulation. Continuous study, studies going on, randomized control trials for these before they come out of the system. But that's happened with all kinds of interventions as well. Once they're out, then all research stops once it's commercially available because of the incentive to make profit. So, Tom, I really want to thank you for this. This is great. We'll offer you more free lunches. So we are adjourned. Please come July 28th to Salty's. Please contribute to future newsletter, which will come to you on an intermittent basis, but we'll share information for all of us. So please continue to also let everyone know, your colleagues and retirees, to join us at lunches and online. So thank you all. Bye-bye.